Hi there. Today we're going to review the Sendmarc tools feature. You can find our tools at tools.sendmarc.com. They're not hidden behind any login or paywall. Publicly available and free for you to utilize. So when you go to tools.sendmarc.com, the first thing that's going to jump out at you is our Know Your Score feature. This is utilized to gain a high level understanding of how things are configured on a given domain. So let's have a look at our Sendmarc Labs domain, which we sometimes use for testing and for training. And you can see immediately, a bunch of really important information is shown to us. So firstly, the domain itself is given an overall score. And we can see that that's 40. The domain is considered high risk. And going into a bit more depth, we can see from an impersonation perspective, there are already some issues. We're scoring at 2 out of 5. We can see that there's a red highlight here over DMARC, telling us that there's an issue with DMARC, ready on the face of it, as well as, low scores for privacy and branding. Now, this is obviously not enough detail to get into some nitty gritty and get into some troubleshooting. So, the detailed report is really going to give us one layer down in terms of information. So firstly, from an impersonation rating, we can see that that's the impersonation rating is really based on 3 metrics, as you would expect, DMARC, SBF, and DKIM evaluations. TLS, RPT, or NTA and MTA SES make up the component parts of privacy, and BIMI makes up the chief mechanism by which we measure the branding rating. And we're also looking at a number of common records, the NS, MX, and A records. Very, very useful, as they are, really important when considering the implementation of DMARC. So the NS records is really going to tell us where we need to go make changes at the DNS level. MX records obviously telling us whether or not there's an everyday sender in place, and in this case there's Exchange, there's the 365 environment, so we already know, okay, from a DMARC perspective we're going to have to go and configure 365, and an A record would tell us whether or not there's a website. Often useful information, considering that websites often contain contact us forms, which generally speaking will generate emails. So very, very useful information just on the face of it. Now you'll notice next to many of the evaluations here, there's this analyze button. What this analyze button is going to do is actually going to take us to the domain analysis section, which actually shows us the actual records that correspond to each of these functions, right? So if I just go ahead and click analyze, or I click domain analysis, it's going to bring us into the domain analysis section, as you can see here. The domain name is still hero, still centered here, and obviously all of the information that you see on the web page corresponds to that domain. So you can see, for example, the SBF and a DKIM record for the sendmarc-labs.com domain. Just by the way, we will run we store a library of DKIM selectors, and we resolve those commonly utilized selectors against the domain in order to identify whether or not we see any common selectors. So certain platforms won't utilize common selectors. Selector 1, just by the way, is utilized by Microsoft, but you might see a platform such as Mimecast, which uses a custom selector for every implementation of DKIM on that platform. So we wouldn't pick up if this particular domain was utilizing DKIM, but I'll show you kind of how we can run those queries, those custom queries, in just a second. As you would expect, there's we're looking to see whether or not there's any of these records, and in the case of sendmarc-labs.com, there's no DMARC record, no TLS, RPT, or MTA SES, and no BIMI record in place. We also give a bit more depth in terms of the records that you would have seen in the Know Your Score in this bottom section here. So we can see that this is a mail sending domain because there's an MX record. We can see who the DNS providers are, and we can see the DNS admin email, which will give you a hint as to where we might be administering this particular domain. The next section, the lookup section, really allows us to run, a series of useful lookups against a given domain. So this goes beyond just the realm of DMARC. Obviously, we're running A and quadruple A record lookups against the domain. We're also looking for any sort of TXTs, MX, etc. Right? This is really where you can go and look to see whether or not there are entries on the root domain that are useful for your analysis. If we wanted to go and have a look at the DMARC record in particular, we simply use this drop down to change to the DMARC evaluation, and it runs a DMARC query. If you want to get into the nitty gritties of a given record type, for example SBF, which happens to be a TXT record, we're going to show you not only the top level of that SBF record, but also the entire underlying tree structure, right? So we can see here that the published SBF record is the Sendmarc redirect. If we go and follow that tree, we'll see that this includes 365 and an IP address, and the 365 IP ranges are all included there. Very useful if you're trying to identify if a given IP address shows up in your SBF record. We've actually got a tool that does exactly that feature, and I'll show you that in just a second. From a DKIM perspective, as I mentioned, we've got known selectors and a selector library that we'll use to resolve to see whether or not there's any resolution against a given domain. But of course, you may want to go and have a look whether or not a particular selector is in place. Let's say, for example, we were using K1, which I believe is SendGrid. In this particular case, there is no SendGrid selector in use on 365, so we're not going to see any positive results out of the sendmarc-labs.com domain DKIM lookup. Very similarly for MTA, STS, and TLS RPT, because these things are not configured on the domain, we're obviously not going to see any resolution against those lookups. Now, the header analysis tool is, in my opinion, one of the best features in our new tools. There's a couple of ways that you can interact with it. I've got a header that's in my clipboard, so I'll just go and paste it in there, and you can see it immediately loads. There's no need for me to click any buttons. And right here in the summary, I'm getting a lot of really important information kind of shown to me. Firstly, I've got the to's and froms, very, very important, as well as the return path, but also I've got this authentication results summary, which is often what we're looking at when it comes to DMARC, right? The authentication results. And we can see that SBF, DKIM, and DMARC pass there. We've also got hop details showing you not only the hops, but the geolocation of those hops. Really important information when you're trying to do routing, or you're trying to understand routing of mails, rather. And again, here's more of that detail regarding the authentication results, as well as a number of other features that are really, really important, or a number of other headers which are really, really important when trying to troubleshoot from a DMARC perspective, as well as a delivery perspective, right? We've also heard a lot of the anti-spam headers that can influence the delivery of a given mail. And if none of that information serves your needs, we do have the raw headers served to you in a very, very readable and very, very easy to interpret fashion over here. Now, I did mention that we've got a tool which allows us to, test whether or not a given IP address appears as part of an SBF record. So let's say, for example, this is going to fail, but it's really just for demonstration purposes. Let's say, for example, I wanted to test whether or not home formed part of the SBF record for sendmarc.com. I would just put in the email address there and the IP address there, run the policy test, and it's obviously going to fail. The IP is not a permitted sender, but if it were to pass, it would tell us exactly where in the entire SBF tree structure that particular IP address showed up. So very, very useful, when trying to understand whether or not an IP address is actually forming part of an SBF. The last two tools, don't really need lots of explanation, but I'll go through them anyway. We've got a CIDR calculator. This is really useful if you're, trying to figure out whether or not an IP forms part of a particular range, or trying to understand, what range you should put in place in an SBF record. And then lastly, certain older, in particular, platforms require that you bring your own private key. This private key generator will help you with the generation of that private key, for your use in your platform. That's it for now. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.